We kicked off this series last week called Senseless, where we want to really kind of understand how fully engaging our five senses changes how we relate to God and how we relate to others. And so some years back, I was living in Atlanta and was working at a church and then was presented with an opportunity to sign a songwriting publishing deal with Sony, and was getting ready to move my life to Nashville. And then God had other plans, but in that process, I was being mentored by a guy named Mike D, who was the lead guy, still is the lead guy for a band called 10th Avenue North. And one of the things that he had mentioned to me is like, hey, if you sign this publishing deal, you need to be ready to be able to put out 25 to 50 songs a week. And just so you guys have an idea, if a good friend of mine, Zach, is in that space still in Nashville, and he is writing, I would say, anywhere from 50 to 70 songs a week. And maybe one of them every month gets picked, and so, or gets used. And so I asked Mike, who had been in that world for a long time at that point, I said, how do you even do that? And he said, here's something that I've done that's helped me exercise this muscle. He said, late at night, I turn on the TV and I mute it and I put it on infomercials. And I challenge myself to write a song based on the infomercial that's on the TV. Now, for those of us that have watched anything on a screen muted, we understand it is a completely different experience, right? If you were to turn a scary movie on and mute it, it probably goes from scary to funny really quick. And so Mike challenged me and kind of held me accountable to trying this for a period of time. And I dug into my iCloud and found one that I wrote years and years and years ago about an infomercial about Flex Seal. How many of us know what Flex Seal is, right? It's that thing that seals any hole and no leaks can come through. And I think it's still pretty popular today. And so I'm not going to sing it for you because I don't know what it sounds like, but I can read you the verse that I wrote for it. Here it is. Don't judge me. Got a leak. Oh, what a deal. Fix it fast with Flex Seal. Thought that was pretty good. Drips and cracks, they disappear. With Flex Seal, there's no more fear. From pipes to roofs, it's so ideal. Seal it up with Flex Seal. And so I would periodically put this into practice and just to kind of exercise this songwriting muscle that eventually God had other plans. And I ended up not taking that deal. And honestly, like looking back, that was the greatest decision I could have ever made. But I want us to share that because I want us to think about how much hearing shapes our experience of everyday life in just small, subtle ways, right? Most of us wake up to a sound, and that sound, it has a lot to do with the mood we wake up in, right? The sound that we've been waking up to is our son trying to get out of his room before his light on his sleep machine turns green. And so as soon as we hear that little the jingling of the door, we're like, oh, and you kind of already wake up a little bit defeated, right? Other sounds help us fall asleep, whether it's a fan or an app that replicates the ocean. How many of you need sound to help you fall asleep at night, right? Or maybe it's a sudden loud sound and it took you an hour to bring your heart rate back down. This happened this week for us. I've been snoring a lot. Apparently, that's what my wife tells me. And so she's been turning on the sound machine on her phone to kind of try to drown my snoring out. And she doesn't start the night with it on. She just turns it on as soon as I start to roar. And there was one night where I guess I started. I don't know if this is true or not. I don't have any evidence. I haven't heard it or anything like that. I've just taken her at her word. And so there was one night where I guess I started to snore, and allegedly, and she turned her noise machine on her phone. And as soon as she turned it on, she said that I like woke up all of a sudden. I was like, what is that? And then she, out of just complete despair, looked at me and said, really? That's what wakes you up? And here's what's funny, is the next day, well, the rest of that night, I was like, man, that felt like such a real dream. And it felt so real, like it actually happened. And then the next day, I'm like, man, in my head, I'm thinking like, man, that's a funny dream. And I'm getting ready to tell her, man, I had this funny dream last night. And right as I'm getting ready to tell her, she tells me this story. And I was like, wait, so it did happen. And it wasn't a dream, right? But we all know what that feels like, right? When you're kind of woken up by a noise all of a sudden, and it maybe takes a while for your heart rate to come back down. But maybe you know someone whose voice is so soothing, they can make bad news even sound relaxing. Here's what science shows us. Science shows us that cursing at a plant, like an actual plant, cursing at it can actually kill it. That is proven by science. And science also shows us that some music can actually kind of calm pain, physical pain, right? How many of you have ever found yourself in a grocery store singing along to a song that you didn't know you knew, right? You just hear this song and all of a sudden you start singing and you're like, oh my God, I didn't even know I knew this song. Right? And if you work out, you probably have a playlist that gets your blood pumping and mind motivated to do something and be somewhere that you really don't want to be. The internet is full of handcrafted playlists to help you focus, relax, study, or party. There's also music that when you hear it puts you in a bad mood. For most of us, it's Creed. If you're a Creed fan, I apologize. Kudos to them, though, for making an incredible career out of their music, right? But we all know, like, as soon as we hear that, can you take me high? Oh, that song, right? For some of you, maybe it's Nickelback. It's all the same. Me and my friends, we call it butt rock. But here's the thing. Sounds don't just influence our moods individually. They impact how connected we are relationally and how we feel relationally. See, our brains are hardwired from birth to hone in on human speech. We can recognize hundreds of voices, identify some after a single sentence, and read the mood of others based on one or two words. And so having a collective listening experience bonds people together, whether it's a concert, speech, alarm, or joke. And no sound is more scientifically proven to bond people together more than laughter. Humans laugh long before they can speak. And research shows that those who laugh frequently are happier and healthier for it. There's something about laughing with other people that's so much better than laughing alone, right? We've all been in a movie theater where we're watching a funny movie and we're with friends and we're in a theater full of people and everyone's laughing and you're laughing so hard and you're about to pee yourself. And you know that kind of, that collective laughter that's contagious, right? There becomes a point where it's not even funny anymore, but you're still laughing because you hear somebody else laughing, right? We've all had moments like that. And you leave that experience kind of like on this like high. There's this joy that comes with it. Now, you go and watch the same movie at home by yourself. It's funny. But I guarantee you aren't laughing as loud as you were in the theater. And there is just something about it being different with people, and the laughing felt good alone, but it felt better with people. And maybe this is why Paul tells us this. Look at what Romans 12:15, it says this, be happy with those, other translations say laugh with those who are laughing, and weep with those who weep. It's interesting that he didn't just say, hey, be sad with people who are sad and happy for people who are happy. He tells us to engage into the physical, audible acts alongside of them that clearly demonstrate we can empathize with what's going on. It's as if Paul knew that we don't just need people to tell us that they get us, but we need proof. We need to be able to hear and see that they get us. We've always been this way. All ancient human societies threaded music into so many facets of life: communal gatherings, work, military, exercises, and religious ceremonies. And the Bible has so many descriptions and instructions related to hearing. One psalmist tells us that God's words light his path. In the New Testament, Paul tells us faith is the result of hearing. Jesus' brother James said we should all be quick to listen and slow to speak. Jesus said his followers know the sound of his voice. And he said elsewhere that anyone with ears should listen and hear. You might be wondering the same thing as this original audience who I'm sure were asking Jesus, well, doesn't everyone have ears to hear? Isn't hearing what we do with them? And maybe this is more than a literal statement. Because as we said last week, the Bible is a work of art and rarely ever means just one thing. Jesus was a master at speaking on multiple levels all at once. And in fact, I think we can identify 6 different types of hearing present in the Bible. And I want to give us those 6 to help us frame the rest of our conversation today. The first, if you're taking notes, is this: it's operative. This is the physical capacity to hear. Right, so let's imagine that we are back at the restaurant that we were at last week, and there's a game on the TV above the bar. The Falcons are playing. Don't tell me the score. You might say, hey, can you turn it up? My friend can't hear very well. Right, that's an operative focus when it comes to hearing. The second is passive. This is the absorption of background information, right? And so you might hear some people saying who's winning, or you might hear somebody on the other side of the restaurant say who's winning, and you say, based on what I'm hearing around me, it's got to be whatever team that table's cheering for, because they've been cheering ever since we walked through the door. And of course, it's a table full of Falcons fans, because Falcons fans got a lot to cheer for this year, because we got a man of God playing quarterback named Kirk Cousins. God cares about sports. You watch and see. The third is selective, which is the act of aiming your capacity in a specific direction, right? So if you lean a little bit this way, you can hear what the couple in the booth next to you is arguing about. How many of you are guilty of doing that? Y'all are like, man, that tea sounds so good, right? We've all done that, right? The fourth is defensive. It's the process of considering an alternative explanation, right? So if you're watching a football game with some friends and there's a pass interference flag thrown, you might say, well, no, technically that was the wrong call. Hear me out. That's what we love to say. Hey, hear me out on that, right? The fifth is attentive, the attempt to understand another's point of view, right? So no, seriously, why do you like a team that doesn't win very often? Right? That's what people are asking Chargers fans all the time. Why do you like that team that doesn't seem to win very often? All right? Active is the action that demonstrates your understanding. So I'm just going to go over there and turn the TV up. She can't hear, and they're not going to do it. And so it is acting on the thing that is consuming your sense of hearing. And so when the Bible mentions hearing, it could be talking about one or all these things, and sometimes it's several at the same time. What we know for sure is that hearing in all its forms are incredibly important to God. And so I want to look at a story about words, hearing, focus, and reacting to what's flowing into our ears. And there's a prophet in the Old Testament named Elijah. And he did a lot of great things for God. He seemed invincible, and God did incredible and obvious miracles through him. And we would say that Elijah heard the voice of God, but it was a different voice that almost destroyed his life. Look at what 1 Kings 19, 2-3a, it says this. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah. May the God strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them. Verse 3a, Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. So Elijah hears what other people are saying about him and saying to him, and he becomes afraid and he runs away. And I think we've all been where Elijah is at this point in his story. You were having a normal day, but then you heard something and it just threw you into a tailspin. Maybe it was a rumor at work or a news story, a diagnosis, a tax bill, a threat, or a phone call from your kid's school or a canceled date. And what happens is when we hear something we don't like, most of us, we don't pray, we panic. But Elijah, who is a prophet, is clearly a lot more spiritual than you and I. Let's look at what he does. Verse 4a, it says this, then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. And so why the hike to the wilderness? Why did he have to go somewhere else to pray? Why couldn't he talk and listen to God where he already was? Isn't God everywhere? Yes, God is everywhere, but if you're taking notes, you can write this down. God can hear you anywhere, but you can't hear him everywhere. And Elijah knew this, which is why Elijah said, I got to get away from all of the noise, because God has the ability to cut through the noise of any environment, but you and I, we don't. Our ears absorb all the sounds around us, but our brains can't process it all at once. They help us by only bringing certain things into our awareness. The catch is, the noisier the environment, the more exhausting it is for your brain to do the work that it needs to do. And the more intently you're focusing on one thing, the more difficult it is for you to hear anything else. This is why, for those of you that are married, this is why your husband has no memory of you asking him to pick up certain things from the grocery store while he was watching the playoff game. I know at the time he seemed to nod yes, but scientifically speaking, he did not hear you at all. He did passively, but not attentively, because his brain was busy processing something else. And most of you ladies have probably realized that a crowded sports bar is not the best place to have deep relational conversations about how you wish you'd feel more heard. He's not gonna hear you there, so you have to go somewhere else where there's a whole lot less noise. And this is getting harder and harder to do because we're constantly surrounded by an ocean of sound, all vying for our attention. Virtually every moment of our lives is full of music and podcasts, or your coworker talking on the phone, the sound the AC makes, and the TV on in the break room, and your phone buzzing, and a calendar alert going off, and a motorcycle rocketing by, and sirens in the background, and dogs barking, and kids fighting, and the voice inside your own head that's telling you you didn't get enough done today. And with everything coming at it, our brains have trouble sorting through what to tell you to listen to. And it's taking a toll. Being surrounded by noise makes us anxious. It spikes our stress. It causes inflammation. It increases our risk of things like heart disease and strokes and hearing loss. It makes it difficult for us to focus, critically think, or fall asleep, and all of which is contributing to a culture of exhaustion, agitation, and depression. And this is where Elijah finds himself. He knew, if I'm gonna hear God, I've gotta get out of here, because all he could hear were the complaints of those who didn't like him and the threats of those who wanted to destroy him. And we know this because when he does pray, he prays this. Look at what verse 4b says. It says this: "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who've already died." And so Elijah's in a pretty dark place. And that's because, if you're taking notes, you can write this down, our feelings aren't determined by the facts, they're defined by our focus. Our feelings are not determined by the facts, they're defined by what we are choosing to focus on with our senses. And for Elijah, he's focusing solely on what he's hearing other people say to him and about him. Look at what verses 5 and 6 say. It says, "Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, 'Get up and eat.' He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and laid down again." Now, I find this part of the story interesting because why didn't God just answer his question? Rather than responding to Elijah, God chooses to feed him. And I think what God understood is that if he had answered his question, Elijah wouldn't have had the ears to hear it, because there were other things going on, right? How many of you have ever tried to have really important conversations with your wife really late at night, right? Maybe as soon as you get in bed. That's what happens in our house. For some reason, when I lay down, I catch that second wind, and Tess gets in the bed. She's like a mummy, man. She gets under that duvet cover. She's like this. And I'm like, how do you sleep like that? I mean, so like that's my cue that she's locked in. When I see them arms by herself, she locked in, okay? But there have been times It doesn't happen so much anymore because she's expressed her frustration with it. But there were times before when I would get in the bed and I'd catch this like quick little second wind and all these thoughts would flood my head. And I would look over and I would ask her a question like, oh, like, what do you think about this? And she's like, now you want to talk? We've been sitting out in the living room for the last 2 hours and now you want to ask this question. And I was like, yeah, I do. And she's like, well, I'm going to sleep. And here's the thing, to her credit, the conversation probably wouldn't be productive at all anyways, right? Because she's not in a space where she is focusing on hearing what I actually have to say. She's gonna miss it, right? Or maybe your wife tried to get you to listen, but no matter what she said, you were angry and feisty, and she was like, I feel like maybe you're not listening to me. In a moment of honesty, you said, yeah, you're right, I'm not. Because I'm hungry. And so I need some food in me before I can hear anything that you're saying. And my hunger is killing my ability to hear. And if your husband ever uses that line, can I tell you that that's true? Scientifically, it is true. Here's why. When one of our senses is in overdrive, the others pull back to help us get our most urgent need met at the time. So if your most urgent need is hunger, you need to taste something. That will be the sense that takes over. So all of the other senses take a step back, right? Like we've all probably been extremely hungry, and then you get to the restaurant. This is how you know. You've all been very hungry, and then you finally get to the restaurant and you start eating. But what is the focus of conversation? Food. How many of us ever had that happen? Right, we were so like desperately hungry, finally get to the restaurant, and the thing that is everyone's talking about is food. Other food that you're not even eating. Right, because that sense was in overdrive and it was pulling everything else back. We've all been at a restaurant where it was so loud that you forget it takes away from the taste of the food that you're eating. Why? Because you're focused on how loud it is in the restaurant. Or maybe for you, it's connected to sight. Like one of the things that I hate is when I go into a restaurant, and there are many of these that we went to in New York City, is when you go to a restaurant for dinner and it's so dark that you can't even see the menu. I'm like, what is the point? And I'm like, maybe my eyes are getting bad. You know it's bad when you got to pull your phone out to turn the flashlight on to see the menu. Y'all can bring the lights up just a little bit. It ain't going to kill the vibe that much, right? But here's why I say that. You become so focused on how dark it is, you're not thinking about the food that you're tasting. You're not thinking about how loud it actually might be, right? I was somewhere, I can't remember where I was this week. I was in San Diego this week, and I was hanging out with about 40 other pastors and thought leaders from around the country. And we're in this room eating lunch, and I'm having a conversation with a guy who's sitting right next to me. And as we're talking, he looks at me and he goes, man, it's so loud in here. And I said, really? Because for me in that moment, I was focused on the food I was eating. Taste was my main thing. For him, he could not get past how loud it was. And so when one of our senses is in overdrive, all the other ones pull back because we're trying, our brain is trying to get the most urgent thing that we need met. And so if you're starving, you can't think, and that makes sense, but that is true in even weirder ways. The louder the restaurant might be, the more difficult it is for you to taste the food. And God knows that because of Elijah's state, where he's been in the wilderness, probably hasn't eaten anything. God knows that, man, if I say anything to Elijah, he's not gonna hear me. He's hungry. I need to feed him. And that's what happens. And so the next morning, his mind and body had reset. And so he continues on his journey and comes to a cave. Look at what 1 Kings 19:9, it says this. Then he came to a cave where he spent the night, but the Lord said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And this is the first time that Elijah hears from God. And I love that the first thing that Elijah hears from God is not an answer, it's a question. And this is the way that God, most of the time throughout the Bible, chooses to engage in conversations with people, getting them to question their own motives and acknowledge that they've been listening maybe to the wrong voices. Look at what verse 11a, it says this, go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. God still doesn't answer his question. Instead, he gives them some instructions, and we can tell that Elijah is hearing God because Elijah he attentively listens, and he does exactly what God tells him to do. And if you're taking notes, you can write this down. The best way to demonstrate you're really listening to someone is to change your behavior based on what they just said. Based on what they just said. Look at what verses 11b through 13, it says this: it was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. Verse 13, when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. There's all these things that are making noise. God's not in it, but as soon as Elijah hears the whisper, he knows whose voice it is. And I think what God is trying to tell Elijah here and us is that if you're only listening to what's loudest, you're not likely to hear me. Here's all these loud sounds, but God's not in those things. He's in that gentle whisper. And I think God is still saying this to us today. Elijah wouldn't have heard it without putting in the work to eliminate 3 levels of noise in his life. And as we get ready to bring this to a close, as the worship team comes back to join me, I want to give us those 3 levels of noise. The first is environmental noise. It's the chaos and concerns of culture and breakneck speed of everyday life. The second is social noise. The voices and relationships you listen to and allow to influence you. The last is internal noise, the unchecked biases and negative self-talk, skewing everything that you experience. And so I wonder what noise might you need to eliminate or escape to actually hear what God is saying to you. For us, if we're honest in the room, or for those of you that are joining us online, if all you hear is CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, whatever other news outlet you want to say, if that's all that you're hearing, no wonder you are anxious about the future. No wonder you are stressed out about this year that we find ourselves in an election year. No wonder you are absolutely terrified about the world that your kids are going to grow up in. Right? If all you're listening to is the voices that you hear on social media, no wonder you can't get out of the rat race of comparison and wondering, man, I should be much further along in my life than I am. I should be further along in my career than I am, or I need to have this thing or that thing. Because maybe for you, it's culture and social media that's the loudest voice in your life, not God's. I think too, even for parents in the room, I think our kids might be the loudest voice in your life. And I'm not telling you to hear your kids. It's important for you to hear your kids. But their voices cannot drown out God's voice in your life. Because what if God's trying to tell you, hey, you know what, in this moment of your kid's life, I actually need you to take a step back and trust me. Or, you know what, in this moment of your kid's life, maybe you think God is gently whispering to you, is like, hey, I need you to lean in a little bit more than you already are. You're doing a great job, but I need you to be a little bit more present because of the season your kid finds yourself in. Maybe for you, it is the internal voices, the negative self-talk that is maybe rooted in things that were outside of your control that have become the loudest voice. But my challenge for us is, what noise might you need to eliminate or escape to actually hear what God is saying to you? See, once Elijah clears out the noise and he turns his attention to God, he hears from him. And he knew it was God he heard, because what he said was something Elijah didn't want to hear. See, I think oftentimes God usually is saying the thing that we don't want to hear. So we say, we listen selectively and we say, that can't be from God because I don't want to do that. See, if God is only affirming what you already think, I'm not sure you're always hearing from God, because God is interested in helping all of us grow. And to grow, you got to learn. And to learn, it requires us to discover where we were wrong and what we need to do to make it right. In other words, if you're wanting to hear God, here's our big idea today. Listen for what you can learn, not just to what is loud. And man, my challenge to us as a church, especially in this season as we get closer to the election, is, man, would we listen for what we can learn, not just to what is loud, because Fox News is gonna be loud, CNN is gonna be loud, NBC is gonna be loud, ABC is gonna be loud. It's gonna be loud. But what are you trying to learn in this season about the people that God has placed in your life, placed around you? And what would that look like? God speaks to us through lots of different things. Something smart for us to do might be taking inventory of everything you're listening to and what it's doing to you. And to be honest, you might not quite be able to see what everything you listen to is doing to you, but the people around you do. So here's a challenge for us all this week. Ask 1 to 3 people who know you well, which voices or noises set you off and which put you on the right track. Listen to them. And for your own sake, demonstrate you heard and understand by acting on what they have to say. What might your life look like if you eliminated the noise that's drowning out God's voice in your life and leaned into whatever magnifies it? And I would take the challenge a step further. We don't like silence because we've been so consumed with noise. But what if you said, you know what, I'm gonna try to find 5 minutes every morning to just be silent. Find a space where it's quiet. Maybe it's locking yourself in a closet because that's the most quiet place in your house, and just 5 minutes. See, I think sometimes we think about silence and meditation as something, is it needing to be like 20 minutes, 30 minutes? 5 minutes in the world that we live in makes a significant impact because there's so much noise around us. And just see what God might do. See what he might do.
South Hills Church, I just want to take a moment and say thank you for watching our service online. Whether you're watching it for the first time or you're watching it again because you enjoyed the service so much from the weekend, I'd like to take a moment and dive into our giving. Every week we give people the opportunity to give back and give to the local church so that God can continue to bless your lives and bless your finances. Here at South Hills, we believe that everything comes from God. We believe that he's the one that chose us and brought us into this world, gave us our gifts and talents and abilities. And I just want you to know that when we give, we are giving back what God has already given to us. If you've ever seen any of our envelopes at a South Hills campus, you'll see on there that it says, every week at South Hills, your generosity is giving people the opportunity to live a better story. And there's a scripture on there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 that says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I want to encourage you today to click down below and set up your giving, whether it's for the first time or whether you're doing reoccurring giving. We have 4 ways to give here at South Hills. 1, you can do it in person at any of our campuses through an envelope. Or 2, you can actually text any amount that you would like to 84321. And the 3rd way is to download our Church Center app. I encourage you to do this one because a Church Center app gives you opportunity to stay connected with our church and your campuses. It's a great tool and resource for you to know what's going on. And the 4th way to give is to give online. You can go to southhills.org/give and you can set up your giving there. Whether you're a guest of our church or whether you are a member of our church, or whether you simply just like to watch our services, I encourage you to trust God with your finances so that he can bless and anoint your finances, and you can be trusting God in this journey of living life to the fullest. I love you, and thank you for watching our online service today.